I am reading Stephen King's books in publication order, and today I want to talk about his second novel, Salem's Lot. This book was originally published in 1975, so that means that here in 2025, this book just celebrated its 50th birthday. I'm still going to consider this a modern vampire story, though, because even though the pop culture references feel a little bit dated, the things that the characters are going through in this book still feel very modern, and Stephen King's writing feels in no way antiquated in this book. I'll keep this first part as spoiler-free as possible. The information that you'll get in this section is pretty much what you would get from the back of the book. And then towards the end, when I'm going over my final thoughts, we'll kind of discuss some spoiler stuff there, but I'll warn you ahead of time. But before we go over the plot, let's go through our main characters first. First up, we have Ben Mears. He is a young novelist who is returning to Jerusalem's Lot, which is the town that he grew up in. And he's doing so to try to avoid some of the things that are going on in his personal life, while also trying to get inspiration for a new book that he's working on. The subject of his new book is also a character in this book. It's the Marston House. It's an old mansion that sits up on a hill overlooking the rest of the town, and conveniently Ben had a traumatic experience there when he was a kid. Next up is Matt Burke. He is an English teacher in Salem's Lot, and he and Ben meet early on in the book and are kind of linked together because they both witness something that they can't explain. Throughout the book, Matt kind of serves as our go-to guy for all the lore about the history of Jerusalem's Lot. And then we have Susan Norton. Susan is a young woman who just graduated from college and is still kind of spinning her wheels in Salem's Lot. She is a fan of Ben Mears' books, so as soon as she realizes that he's in town, she's pretty interested from the jump. Of course, they wind up dating, and they're our love interest for the book. We then have Mark Petrie, who is a young boy, probably like a preteen, who is honestly one of the coolest characters in this story. He is obsessed with like comic books and horror stories, so he pretty much knows what to do when all these crazy things start to happen in town, and he actually teaches the adults a lot throughout the course of this story. And speaking of things going crazy, we then have Kurt Barlow, who is an elusive, mysterious man who moves into the Marston house right after the book starts. He and his assistant, Richard Straker, decide to open an antique store in town, but nobody ever really sees Barlow out and about. We just see Straker out during the day. Sometimes, if you look up at the Marston house on the hill at night, though, you can see lights going on and off. And then to round out our cast, we have Jimmy Cody and Father Callahan. Cody is the town's doctor, and Father Abraham is a Catholic priest. They join our good guys in their quest to try to fight off what's going on in the town. Moving on to the plot. I'm sure you have gathered a lot of what's going on from my descriptions of the characters, but I'll fill in some of the loose holes, again, while trying not to spoil too much of the story. Shortly after Barlow and Straker arrive in town, two young boys wind up going missing, and a day or two later, one of them is found dead. No one can figure out how he died, and everyone in town gathers for a funeral, and then we get to see different people kind of dealing with the aftermath of this tragedy. And then, a few days after he's buried, the young boy shows up at the window of Mark Petrie late at night, knocking on the window and asking to be let in. Let's just say that Mark resists him, but the other people who the young boy visits at night don't seem to resist him as well. And then before long, we have an entire town of people who are afflicted by this thing, and more people are active at night and then keep themselves shut in away from the daylight during the day. Fortunately, though, our main characters seem to know what's going on, and they team up to try to defeat this thing before it can consume the entirety of Salem's Lot. As with a lot of Stephen King's books, I feel like one of the main themes in this story is the loss of innocence. Of course, we have like Mark Petrie, who is a young man who is just encountering like death and loss and things like that for the first time, so clearly he's losing his innocence. But we also have the loss of innocence on a grander scheme where everybody in this town kind of realizes that the natural world that we all live in obviously doesn't work like we thought it did, because things like what's happening in this town suddenly can happen, and it's turning everything they thought they knew about reality on its head. The other thing I feel like this story tries to grapple with is the difference between evil and like capital E evil. The town is full of people who for years have committed small sins on a daily basis, and it's a small town where everybody sees everything else that everyone is doing. So we've just had this slow descent in this town where people are just getting away with more and more cruel things as the years go on. For example, there's infidelity and there's drug use and there's people just being crooks and pulling things over on their neighbors. And this happens like out in broad daylight, literally. So I feel like King is asking the question, how do these small evils compare to like a capital E evil, like a monster who can come in the matter of weeks fully decimate a town and drag it down into a darkness that we didn't think was possible. Either way, both realities were leading towards destruction. They're just obviously on very different scales. Alright, and now it's time for some of my favorite scenes in this book. Obviously, this is the time where I have to throw this up. The scene where Danny floats up to Mark Petrie's window feels like a classic vampire story, and it reads like an old school 70s, 80s horror movie. It was just... And while we're speaking about Mark, I feel like he is central to a lot of my favorite scenes, so I'm going to go over those real quick. The part where he is tied up and restrained in the Marston house, and he thinks back to all the comic books and books that he's read about how to survive in the wilderness, and he remembers how to wiggle his way out of the ropes. I don't know, that just felt like a very like Boy Scouts MacGyver thing, and I really enjoyed that scene, even though it wasn't necessarily scary. The other one of his that I really enjoyed was the part where Barlow had taken his parents, and Barlow is making this big profession about how the next time he comes back, he's going to go after Mark, and Mark literally spits in his face, and just kind of like unravels Barlow and sends him into a crash out. Other iconic scenes that stuck with me, the school bus scene. That bus driver was always rude to his passengers, so when they all turned into vampires and decided to trap him on his bus and annihilate him, I don't know, that was just pretty interesting. And then of course you have the scenes in the Marston house, like at the beginning when the delivery drivers are unloading the crate and they have these really weird creepy vibes going on, and they don't even realize what or who is in the crate that they just dropped off in the basement. And then of course that really gruesome trap that they set up below the stairs, like that was just, I don't know, Barlow was an awful person. I really enjoyed this book. This was actually the second time that I read it. First time I read it was a couple years ago, so this time when I was working my way through, I did listen to the audiobook for some sections of it. Either way, I still think that this book holds up even though it is half a century old at this point. I do feel like it is a unique and interesting take on the vampire lore. The vampires in this book are not the same as like Dracula or Carmilla and like all the old school English vampires that we're used to. Somehow while you're reading this story, it feels like a slow burn while also kind of being a thriller once the action picks up. In the beginning, we are literally immersed in this town and getting to know these characters, and the build-up is really, really slow. But once things start to happen, I couldn't stop reading. And with the way the book ended, I just think it's really cool that we wound up with Ben and Mark going around the country, probably stopping other vampires along the way. If you have read Salem's Lot, I would love to know what you thought about this book in the comments below. And I would also love if you would stick around because I am working my way through Stephen King's entire catalog. Also, if you're interested in more short form content where I post about these books without necessarily spoiling them, I am posting shorter videos on TikTok and Reels and places like that. You can find it on my profile. Anyways, you know what's coming up next, right? It's The Shining. Okay, bye.